My role is really, as a scientist, talking about why we must degrow, that we will stop growing and we will decline. And our choice is whether we do that in a managed way, which is what I'm really pushing for, rather than we wait for disaster and crash and all of the horrible things that go with that. And so I'm going to just, that's kind of, I'll keep referring people to that website to as the place for the answers, or to come along to the conference that's going to be the weekend of the 16th, 17th, I think it is, of September at Victoria University, Rutherford House, next to the railway station. But again, the details are on the website, and you can stay at home and watch online if you like, but there's going to be some great speakers there. So I'm a tiny voice, and the degrowth movement is growing, but we are tiny in comparison to the resources, the money and effort that goes in from big business, supported by governments, to convince people that we can just carry on living out as we are and we can keep on taking from the planet. So that business as usual drive is something that I'm really up against. And there's so few people talking about this reality. Greta Thunberg is one of the few. It's really interesting that a young woman like that is showing the strengths of leadership that is utterly missing from our governments and from big business as well. And I want to, if I don't say it later, I want to say it now, that there are lots of positive things about a world that isn't growing, a post-growth world. We had glimpses of it in the first lockdown, the COVID lockdown, where the streets were taken. Where I live, kids took over the streets again. The traffic noise disappeared. We started to appreciate nature, came back again. This much simpler, quieter life. And I know that everyone I know, if they get a chance for a holiday, if they're well off enough to be able to take a holiday, they always will choose tramping, or in my case, sailing on an old sailboat, or going to the beach to live in a tent, or some simpler life. Seems to be a strong urge in us to simplify our lives, but there is this huge pressure against that. Okay, so I want to talk about this. Really what I'm going to emphasise is the biophysical limits to growth that are obvious on a tiny little planet that we could see in that picture where, looking at Earth from Mars, we're just this speck in space. There are obvious limits, and we kind of kid ourselves that we don't have to worry about them. But right back in the 1970s, there was a group of young scientists at MIT in the States who built the first models that looked into the future and ran a bunch of scenarios about different futures that humans could go through. And this is kind of it's been updated since then. This was a look in 2010. The line that's shown there is 2030, but the end of the, so you got the solid lines, and then they go into heavy solid lines. So 70s is when the model started, the prediction run that's here. And you can see the solid line there shows how accurately the predictions, which are the dotted lines, have been followed. I'm an ecological modeler, and there are no published ecological models that I can think of that have proven to be as accurate as this. And we're now 50 years on, and most recent update was by Gaia Harrington, who is a partner in a very, what I would think of as a very conservative consulting firm, and she has ended up doing a thesis on this and then writing a book on it, and just amazed about how accurate that's been. This is the business as usual run. So the scenarios that they ran, this is the business as usual. So we have pretty much done business as usual. We haven't altered how we live, and the predictions show there'll be massive changes that we're just starting to enter now. You can break them down into, again, this is just pulling apart some of those lines on the graph there, but just amazingly accurate. And the declines in resources and increases in pollution, and then all of those inflections that are about to happen. And these inflections, these changes are examples or they're kind of the proof, the manifestation of us exceeding the limits to growth, the limits of the planet to be able to absorb the way that we live. And so there's just this, when you start getting, scientists are inherently conservative, and when you start getting tens of thousands of scientists becoming more and more adamant in their warnings, and you start to see, I mean, I don't have time to go through all these graphs, but there is massive change, particularly the last 30 years. I mean, we were on the wrong track, and then we just put the foot down in the last 30 odd years, and massive impacts and changes on the planet, to the extent that you get warnings like this, that if we don't act soon, there'll be catastrophic biodiversity loss and untold amounts of human misery. Just incredible changes. Even, these conservative scientists starting to use, phrases like avoiding a ghastly future. I think we should, it's a frustration as a scientist that we get so, all of the reports, all of these things that come out, they might make page 5 or something in the paper, and they might just get picked up for an hour or so on TV, for a minute or so on TV, and then completely forgotten again in a mass of all the other rubbish that's fed to us. And yet they're so crucial. If anything, the mainstream media is picking up on climate change, but that's a trap. It's a very myopic kind of view, because there are all sorts of examples, and I've listed some of them there, of exceedances of these limits to growth that are crises on their own. But the one thing that they all have in common is they're not problems that have solutions. It's part of a predicament. The predicament is overshoot. Climate change is a symptom of us overshooting planetary boundaries. It's just, that's the one case that makes the news the most. It may override all of the other things, but the one thing they have in common is the answer to them all is to reduce our consumption, is to degrow. There's so many ways of measuring or looking at it. The plot on the left there just is some work that's come out of Stockholm Institute, some researchers there that have and you may have heard of Kate Raworth and her donut economics, kind of using the same thing. That circle in the middle is the safe area, and these are just breaking up these components into areas where we've overthrown. So down the bottom here, the biogeochemical flows, phosphorus and nitrogen, the things that I've been working on in fresh waters, we've massively overshot the planetary boundaries or the limits for that. Land use system change out here. This is extinction rate, massive increase in the rate of extinction, the 6th grade extinction that we're going through now. Novel entities, these things that we've created that we don't know how they're going to react with, or we can see that they react negatively with the other life forms on the planet. And that, I mean, that's making the news now. The example on the right of the exceedances of the temperature, really, really extreme temperature change that's happening right now, where humans just can't survive that, let alone the animals and the life that have never experienced these kind of temperatures before. And when it comes to what's enabled this massive growth that's causing these problems is fossil fuels, this one-off legacy of energy from the past that was captured and comes to us in a form with an incredible density that's enabled so much change to happen in such a short time. And natural systems that we used to use, like farming, like being able to grow food on the land, is now and is becoming more and more dependent on fossil fuels. So that we've got there is agriculture, aquaculture, forestry and fisheries. And back in the 70s, 43% of the energy coming from that, or required 43% of what makes it work came from fossil fuels, and now up to 62%. So we're just becoming more and more dependent on fossil fuels for our food. The plot on the right there is just showing those exceedances of planetary boundaries again, but what the black dots tell us is how much the influence of animal agriculture is. So animal agriculture is a huge part of these overshoots, and I'll touch on that a little bit more, but 68% of the terrestrial land surface of the planet is now tied up with agriculture and forestry, and a huge proportion of that is required for animals. 22% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from food, and in the last couple of decades alone, the animal-based food products have contributed to 95% of the increase in greenhouse gas emissions from food. So more and more people becoming wealthy enough to have animal food in their diet, and just more and more dependence on that, but not natural. I'll show you what I mean by that coming up. I just wanted to touch on New Zealand and where we are. I don't know, we've been very good at convincing ourselves that we're clean and green. We use this 100% pure tourism label. I became very aware during my time in the last 2 or 3 decades of just how false that is. So on this plot here shows country overshoot days. So this is the day when the country exceeds the planetary, the ability of the planet to support us. So once you get past that date, then you go into deficit. You need more planets than what we have to be able to support your lifestyle. So here is New Zealand back at April 19th. So a couple of months ago, 3 months ago nearly, we started going into deficit. And you may not be able to, so starting here's the worst country in the world, Qatar. In February it exceeded. But you come around here and here's this bunch of bad countries. We're right in the middle of Saudi Arabia, Germany, Israel, Czech Republic, Austria, Sweden, some European countries there, you know, and we just, that's where, so, and this other plot here is another study that was done on environmental performance indicators. And in this case, it was a whole bunch of them, like water quality, fertilizer use, marine captures, just the suite of measurements that we use to kind of measure how a country's rating. And you won't be able to make it out, but down here in New Zealand, it's got number 18 next to it, so we're 18th in the world. That is 18th from the bottom of 189 countries, not 18th from the top, 18th from the bottom. We're amongst the worst, we're in the worst 20% of countries on the planet. That's per capita. You take it from per capita, we go to about 161 from the top, so about 40 something from the bottom of the countries of the world overall. We are nowhere near, in no way could we be considered green. We might be green because of all the fertilizer we put on and water we put on, but we're not clean and far from it. And that's, we've kind of kidded ourselves and we've kidded the rest of the world. The most common thing I hear from overseas people is that they come here expecting to find this clean and green country, and often they're not happy with what they see. So just to touch on, coming back to that animal agriculture and the impacts that that's having, to put into, to try and get across and understand just how huge our impact on the planet is. If you take the weight of all the animals, we'll start with the mammals on the planet, and here it is here, 97% of the weight of all the mammals on the planet are us and the animals we eat. So 3% of the weight of animals on the planet is, whether you use animals or mammals, it's not much different, are us and the animals that we eat. 3% are wild animals, so no wonder we, forget climate change and everything else, no wonder we have a biodiversity crisis when we dominate this planet so much. And it's all about us, and it's all about us being able to eat meat. That's cattle, the big bar in the middle. And here's 10,000 years ago, the weight of animals. We've had a 700% increase of the weight of animals on this planet, or the biomass of animals on this planet. And it's all about fossil fuels. It's all about taking energy from the past to be able to massively increase the biomass of animals and the amount of production that's coming off the planet. And that's caused these huge declines. There's 94% decline in animal populations in the Americas, 84% of freshwater animal communities declining. Not surprisingly, the freshwater stuff happens first because it integrates everything that's happening on the land. But it's not just humans. Sorry, it's not just animals. It's humans as well. We have extreme inequality, just stretching out more and more, with the wealthy world and the poor world, and overweight and too well fed and junk food at the top end, and people, a billion odd people with either starving or insecure diets at the bottom. So we just stretch out that big difference all the time. And most of the people in the room here, I guess, would like me remember be able to just physically, visibly see the reduction in the number of insects there are when you consider how many used to get squished on the windscreen compared with now. It's all about nitrogen in this case. So this graph here, I don't know how many of you can make out what's going on here, but it's talking about, we talk about the green revolution, where we massively increased the production of food on the planet, which enabled the massive increase in population. But we did it by, back in the 1930s, so nearly 100 years ago, a couple of German scientists figured out a way of using gas, fossil gas, to be able to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into reactive nitrogen that then could be put on the land to grow food. So this graph here, the line, reddish sort of dotted line there, shows the increase. Basically, that's the number of people that could be fed under the current food system. If you took nitrogen out, the planet could feed less than 3 billion people. But that's only under our current food system, because it's so much dominated by animals. So much of that energy and fertilizer is going into growing animals. If you took them out of the picture and used it to grow just food instead of animals, and then eat the animals, then there would be feeding the planet would not be such a problem at all. But this massive increase here is the percent of population that's fed by the Haber-Bosch nitrogen. And so it's driven this population increase, but it's only because we're eating the past. And this is some from the European Science Foundation talking about nitrogen as perhaps the greatest single experiment in global geoengineering that humans have ever made. So we now create more nitrogen using man-made processes from fossil fuels than all of the natural systems put together. We've utterly altered the nitrogen cycle, among others. And you could argue that carbon dioxide is just as much the greatest single experiment, but it's had huge impacts, and it is a big part of the problem for feeding the planet, but only because we use so much of it for animals. And it's not just the fertilizer, it's just every step of the process in our modern food systems where we have more and more energy going in. So to the state of now, just looking globally at different food systems, somewhere between 10 and 33 units of energy go in for every unit of energy we get out of food. Or in the States, 21 calories of fossil energy goes into getting every 1 calorie of food energy out. So massively energy negative. And it's not, this is kind of a breakdown. This is the energy in and the energy out from the US food system. But it's this little grey bit down the bottom is the actual farming and growing of this stuff. The rest of it is all the household, the big one up there is household storage and preparation, food services, wholesale, retail, packaging, all of the other stuff, all of the, if you just grow a spud in the garden and eat it, it's massively positive energy return on energy invested. What you buy in the shop, and crazily in this country, something like 80% of the food that's in the supermarket that we buy is imported. And then most of that is highly processed as well. So that's where the big fossil fuel footprint comes in there. But it also marks this really weird change where, I'll touch on it more, but there has to be a positive energy return on investment for life. So for life to exist on this planet, whether it's a leopard or a plant in your garden, there has to be more energy comes out than you put in, otherwise you won't be around in the future. But we've weirdly gone into this situation where we put way more energy into our food than we get out of it, and it's a very temporary, unsustainable thing to do. So our food system has exceeded all of the boundaries. We're eating the future. I mean, people talk about, the future eaters. Tim Flannery wrote a book called The Future Eaters, but we're eating the past, and we have a net energy loss rather than gain, which is just crazy. We can radically change our food systems and feed the world, but we need that energy as well under our current system. So we've got to replace that. For so many reasons we have to stop using fossil fuels, and there's a lot of talk about this transition that we need to make away from fossil fuels. And I want to just get onto decarbonisation, because there is so much spin and so much hype out there about this change. I just want to get some reality. Okay, so this is looking at per capita energy globally, and we're going from 1850 to 2020 here. This tiny little bit here is nuclear, that's gas, that's oil, that's coal. There's our things we call renewables along there, hydro and other renewables. And I'm going to use the word renewables so that you guys know what I'm talking about. But actually they're rebuildables, right? It's a false, the energy that they're capturing is renewable, but the infrastructure we use to capture, whether it's a dam or a solar panel or a wind turbine, is a rebuildable thing. I was involved in consenting a whole bunch of wind turbines on the Tararuas, and working for council, and as a consultant ecologist for council, and already, just so in the very short time that I've been doing that, a whole bunch of the turbines that were consented have had to be replaced, completely replaced. They can still use the foundations, but everything else on it's been replaced. Anyone who's got solar panels and had them for a while will have now realised that they don't last that long either, and they need replacing. So it's a rebuilding constantly that you have to think about when you think about renewables. Okay, so if I ask people in this room, I'm sure most people would proudly tell me that we're 80% renewable in New Zealand, if they hadn't already read my slide. And then I would say, yeah, that's electricity. Sometimes it's up to 85% is renewable, rebuildable. But that's just electricity. That's a tiny proportion of the total energy we use. And if we look at total energy, it's 28% of the energy we consume in this country that is renewable. And then the crucial thing is that has not changed since 1990. And in fact, if I could go back further, we only have figures going back to 1990. If I could go back further and further, it's actually would have been much higher in the past than it is now. So, because what the problem is, as fast as we build wind turbines, and you can see them around the hills all around New Zealand now, and solar panels on the houses all over the show, as fast as we build this stuff, we increase our energy consumption. So we're not displacing fossil fuels, we're just adding to energy consumption. So we're not winning. We've huge amounts of concrete, huge amounts of roading and infrastructure gone in, and we haven't made one iota of improvement in that proportion. And globally, that proportion hasn't changed either, despite all of the hype you hear about renewables. No one will point out, or very few people will point out, that the proportion has not changed. We're just adding it as fast as we do. So there's New Zealand. Since 1990, that red line is the proportion of renewables. So there's been a few squiggles along there, but the start and finish are 28% renewable energy for our total consumption. In my lifetime, so this graph was, the data actually lines up perfectly with the year that I was born, 1959, and that's New Zealand, and that's the average per capita proportion of total energy use that is renewable. This is total energy consumption. So in my lifetime, it's gone from 1,600 up to 4,500. So that would go for most of us in this room here. There is an upside to this little plot, is that a lot of us in this room will be as old as me, or some people in this room, sorry, will be as old as me, and we'll know that back then when we only used that much energy, life wasn't that bad. You know, as much as everybody wants to convince you that halving your energy consumption, or in this case, more than halving your energy consumption would be the end of the world, those of us who have lived this long know it wasn't that bad without all this stuff. So, but it just shows that we just keep adding, and we keep adding to consumption. We have more and more junk, we have more cars, we have bigger houses, we have more gadgets. We just keep adding gadgets to our lives, and that's why we don't win. So basically the shift over time has been from biomass, then we discovered coal, and then the rest of the hydrocarbons like oil, where we started really getting into it. And trying to think about how we're going to transition to this carbon-free future that is being sold to us is to understand energy density. Really, really crucial to understand density. That's just how much oomph there is in a packet, you know. So here's the things that we use in transport at the moment. Oil, diesel, jet fuel, and I'll put in there biodiesel and vegetable oil as well. They all fit in there. This is just a plot of the energy per litre or per kilogram. So by weight or by volume, this cluster up here is what we need to fly jets into big trucks and all that kind of thing. Then as you go down the plot, you get to lower and lower densities with liquid hydrogen out there, CNG. Right down in the bottom corner here is batteries, lithium-ion batteries, the best of our battery technology. And they're almost off the bottom of the graph there. They're very low energy density. I mean, a really simple explanation would be, I don't know how many of you have got EVs, but if you took my little Corolla and put 60 litres of gas in it, which will weigh about 60 kgs, I could drive to Auckland on it. 60 kgs of battery might get you to, I don't know, Poirua or something like that, you know. That's the difference, just so that you can understand that difference in energy density. So nothing that we have coming up can match that energy density. So you're not going to see planes flying around with hydrogen. You'll see planes with batteries in them, but they might just get across the strait and that's about it, because they can't go those huge distances because that energy density is so low. But then you can say, well, what about biodiesel and vegetable oil? We can just make the energy to be able to fly the planes. The trouble is this thing called energy return on energy invested that I talked about. It turns out that to make that biodiesel or to make that stuff, you'll end up putting, by the time you dig up the paddock and put the crop in and harvest it and take it away somewhere and process it and package it and put it back into the plane or the, you know, whatever it is, you used up just as much energy as you'll get out of it. You may as well not have bothered. You could have saved all of that land for growing food, because the energy that it takes to grow the biofuels means that the energy return on energy invested is bugger all. It's next to nothing. So don't even bother. So you can do it, but you wouldn't do it. One of the best ways of kind of, to me, to get across this idea of energy and how much we don't understand it and how much we take for granted is this, and you can go onto YouTube and just Google track cyclist toaster or something like that and you'll find this. It's really funny. This big Olympic cyclist with thighs on him as big around than me, just as thighs, gets on this machine here and it's hooked up to a generator to that little pop-up toaster there. Put a bit of toast in there. He goes for it. He gives it heaps. It's sweat pouring off me, basically. Falls off the bike and then pull out this bit of toast and it's just brown. It's not even toasted enough for me to want to eat. And this is this idea of converting it to human equivalent so that we can understand just how much energy we consume. And we don't even think about it. We pop the toaster down and we don't think twice about it. He's producing 697 watts. If you ever go to the gym and get on an exercise cycle or a running machine or a rowing machine, have a look at how much you can produce. I can do just over 100 watts. So the average human can put out about, you convert that energy and you can work out that, say for that tank of gas that I was talking about for my car to drive to Auckland, if you were to work out how many humans it would take to produce that energy, it turns out that you've got in that tank of gas that might cost $80, $90 at the moment, equivalent to 4.5 years' work of a human. A slave that you've got in that tank of gas for 4.5 years, you don't have to feed them or clothe them or do anything else. And then if you take all of the other energy use, it turns out there are 70 human slaves for every human on the planet. But of course it's not evenly spread. Us in the rich world will have 200 or 300 slaves working for us 24 hours a day whenever we want to. They're there working for us. Jump in your car, take 180 people pushing your car to it to be equal to how much. And so you see people, I laugh now, I understand it. I see people in the traffic scowling and stuck in the traffic in their car. No way, or complaining about the price of petrol. No understanding of what an incredible privilege it is that we live in this time now where we have this massive energy and all these slaves working for us that we don't even have to look at who do all this work for us. And if we convert all of our energy use on the planet, then it turns out to be equivalent to 500 billion slaves that we have working for us from fossil fuels. And so it works out to way less than a cent an hour we pay them, no matter whether it's petrol or electricity prices that you're talking about. Ask any economist about this. They won't even think about this fact that we have all of these slaves doing work for us. They talk about productivity. Productivity comes from, one person and a spade. Give them a tractor or a front-end loader, and you've got equivalent to a couple hundred people. Your productivity goes up massively because you've got a piece of machinery that's taking the past and turning it into current energy. But we take it for granted. So this idea of the energy return on investment, I talked about it from an animal or a plant's point of view. Like if that leopard doesn't catch that whatever it is, warthog. If it doesn't catch it, if it runs around all week and doesn't catch it, then it will eventually die. There has to be more energy back. And I worked on native freshwater fish in New Zealand on migration and tried to, figure out why it is that they make these massive migrations, what's in it for them. And it just turns out that the Professor Charlie Hall in the States who coined the term energy return on energy investment back in the 70s was also working on migrating native fish, and he did an energy analysis on it, and it turned out that for every unit of energy the fish puts into migrating, there's an energy return of 14. So an EROI, energy return on investment of 14. One unit of energy and gets you 14 back. When we humans first discovered fossil oil, Taranaki bubbled up on the beach at New Plymouth out of the ground. So you could grab that, and the energy return on investment was something like 70. For every unit of energy you got used to get that oil and process it and put it in your car, you got 70 back. By the time we kind of got into the 1970s, it was down to about 30. Now we're hovering around 12 or 13. So 1 barrel of oil now gets us 12 or 13 back. Quite simply, we've taken all the easy stuff. Now, if it wasn't for the Permian, a couple of big oil fields keep on producing that are kind of keeping the average up, most of the fields are in decline, and you talk about fracking and tar sands and things like that. You're literally trying to squeeze blood out of a stone, and there is so much energy goes into getting that back that it's only being done because the costs aren't being paid. The roads are being given to them and all of that kind of thing. They're not having to pay for it. So as that decline happens, it has big implications. So this is a very recent paper that's looking at by 2050 to get fossil fuels, about half of the energy that you get back has to go back into getting it, because all the easy stuff's gone. I don't know, there's so many equivalents that you can understand whether it's fruit on a tree or, and I'll touch on metals in the ground. When you first discover them, and there's lots of them, it's really, really easy. You pick the easy fruit, and then it gets harder and harder after that. So this graph, again, it starts on my birth year, but what this is showing here is this is kind of how energy works in the economy. And So some of the energy has to go back into getting the energy. And as the amount of energy going back in gets bigger, that one arrow there that keeps getting squeezed and squeezed and squeezed is discretionary energy or discretionary money in the economy. So what makes us wealthy is that we get more back than we put in fossil fuels. And as that goes down, that's less and less money available in the economy as we squeeze it, because that's where our money comes from. So if we look at this, this is the resource pyramid here. This upside down pyramid is showing that when we first discover oil, the EROI is very high, and as we start getting down into, you know, onshore heavy, and then deep water, and then polar or Arctic oil, and then shale and fracking and tar sands, the return on investment becomes less and less and less. And there's a real big multiplicative problem here in that the resources that we need, this is the resource pyramid here for things like metals that we need for decarbonising, for making our solar panels and wind turbines and everything else that we talk about. The easy stuff's gone. You know, when we first discovered copper, you know, there were big lumps of it that you could pull out of the ground. Now you have to process more and more and more and more, so the cut-off grade keeps going down. So, for example, some figures that I saw for our offshore wind farm, wind turbine, which this government's talking about at the moment, 30 tonnes of copper for one big turbine, 30 tonnes of copper, which required 50,000 tonnes of material to be dug up and processed to get that out. And that's just going to keep on going up. You're going to have to dig up more and more of the earth because the amount of what you're trying to get out of it is diminishing. At the same time, the availability of energy is going down because you're having to put more and more back into getting the energy. You see how those two things work on each other and make it so much harder as you go into the future? This is just, there's that, the number of people on the planet there. Here's the energy use per capita. I showed the New Zealand one, but this is global, and you can see that it's nearly all fossil, and biofuels is actually going down. Starting at 1820, we use less and less bioenergy, and we've replaced it with these fossil fuels here. Total energy consumption there going up and up and up. There's all the materials, the increase in materials. So all of these non-renewable materials that we're digging up to build these things, massively increasing, whether it's for our vehicles or for our toys, our TVs, our everything else that we have to have now. Massive increase, and they're all non-renewable things. So we're just mining the hell out of the planet. So just looking at that energy mix, and these boxes are roughly the size of the proportion in our makeup. So the biggie's oil, then there's gas, coal, hydro, nuclear, wind, solar. Some of them going direct use as energy for powering everything we do, for physically powering it, then electricity that we use for all the rest of it. So in the future, we're going to have to get rid of those, right? Otherwise we won't be able to live on this planet. It's already becoming iffy whether how much longer for many parts of the world we'll be able to stay there. So they've got to go so that we can have a chance of a livable future climate-wise. So what are we going to replace them with? Well, hydro. Generally, pretty much all of the rivers in the world that could be dammed have been dammed, and that would go for New Zealand as well. And there are massive impacts with, I mean, people talk about, you know, pumped hydro or creating dams, or, you know, I've spent the last decade or two trying to stop dams from happening in New Zealand, the Mokia Nui, the Rui Tanawha, because of the ecological harm that they would do. But you also have the fact that if you dam a river and it forms a lake, or if you pump water uphill to make a lake, then for the first 10 to 20 years you've buried all of this biological material in that dam, and so as it breaks down anaerobically in the bottom of the dam, it will give off methane. So you have these big hydro lakes that give off so much methane that you don't gain anything from your renewable electricity for 10 to 20 years until that methane stops bubbling out of that lake that you created. So they're not like a quick fix. And people think of dams as being long-term. I've been involved through first taking my students there and then being a submitter and doing some work. I did my master's on native fish in Taranaki. And the Patea Dam was built in 1984. I don't know if any of you remember that. It's a river, the Patea River was dammed to form a big, long, skinny lake, Lake Rotorangi. And in that, then in 2010, because there was no RMA then, when the RMA came in, they were given time to prepare the case. In 2010-ish, there was a resource consent application process for that dam. In that time, from 84 to 2010, that lake had lost half of its capacity. So in another 20, 30 years, it won't be a dam anymore. It'll be just a run of the river tip over the edge, because the sediment that builds up in that dam, because of all the land use changes that's happened around it, means that that's a very temporary dam. All dams are temporary, but that's the kind of time scale we're thinking about for some of the dams. We already have old dams in New Zealand, small ones that are no longer dams. The lake has filled up with sediment and it's not a dam anymore. Well, it's a dam, but it's not doing anything. So that's the kind of reality about hydro. It's not some magic solution. It's certainly better than some other things. Then there's nuclear. It's expensive, incredibly expensive, and part of that, I just listened to an interesting podcast yesterday. There are a bunch of people who are very pro-nuclear who claim that the reason that it's really slow to build nuclear is bloody environmentalists have scared everybody and they put so many conditions on the builders that it makes it very slow. The last plant that I know of really big, I mean, a whole bunch of countries like Germany and Japan have been shutting down nuclear power plants, although Japan's turning around again. But there's been a hell of a lot of closing down of nuclear power plants because of fears and problems. Fukushima, for example. But the last big one in France that has been or was due to be commissioned about now, it's taken 30 years from the day of building to getting it up and running. Maybe it's those bloody environmentalists, maybe it's not. But the reality is that it's incredibly expensive, incredibly slow, and there are lots of, ever since I was born, there has been the promise that this, you know, there's a magic thing going to happen with nuclear and there's going to be this, you know, new example coming out, but I'll touch on that in a minute. Then you've got wind, big installation, environmental, big material footprints, huge, you know, concrete based foundations and things that they have to have, those massive blades, you know, incredible impacts of building them, and then you have to rebuild them again. And solar, the same, huge amounts of materials and energy go into building them. And the thing is that they're intermittent, okay, they're great. Anyone who's got a solar panel will know what I mean. I've got one on this old boat. 160 watts is what it's rated at. So for an hour a day when the sun's out and the sun's hitting that thing bang on, it will produce somewhere close to 160 watts. But if you average that out, remembering that at night the sun doesn't shine, on cloudy days it's less and less and less. On average, over a year, I'll get about 16 watts out of that. Because, you know, that's the... So when you hear somebody say, or you read in the paper, they've installed 160 megawatts of solar panels, remember that it's only about 10% of that. In Europe, it's, say in the UK, it's about 4% of that. If you take it over the entire year, and remember that it only will last for 10 to 15 years if you're lucky, and then you'll have to throw it out and make a new one. So just be careful. The same with wind. They will say this will power a whatever size city. Yeah, when the wind's blowing, it's not too strong and it's not enough, it will, but it doesn't do that all the time. And if you want to be able to switch on stuff and have it instantly when you want it, then you have to fill it in with something else to fill in that gap. And that's maybe something we could change, that expectation that we'll always have power exactly when we want it. That's part of the problem. Okay, so then there's the other options of biofuels, which I mentioned, that energy return on investment is break even or negative. Hydrogen, it's hyped up so much. It's not an energy source, it's a transfer mechanism. You can create hydrogen using electricity, and then to do anything with it, you have to compress it, and you have to freeze it if you want to take it anywhere, any distance. So, in every step, if you know any of the laws of thermodynamics, every step there is a loss. So you can take this very high quality thing called electricity, and then you turn it into hydrogen. You lose about half of the energy along the way, and then you have this very volatile, very leaky. The molecules are so small they'll find their way out of most connections and even through steel. So it's hyped up, and it's very easy to get people like Megan Woods excited about it. There's a hydrogen industry is just extremely vocal because it's getting lots of investment. Oil and gas love it because it is seen as a way we can keep our current infrastructure going. You can con people into thinking they're going to be able to fly around in hydrogen planes. You can con politicians into thinking that we can have a hydrogen industry here. There'll always be hydrogen in use. It has uses, but it will never be able to replace fossil fuels, and we would just be idiotic to even try because it is so incredibly wasteful. It is so hard to find out this information because getting money from investors and from gullible governments is a huge industry for the hydrogen industry at the moment, and the truth is coming out in some parts of the world where governments have been conned into it. They've set up buses and trains and things to run on it, and they've dropped it again very, very quickly when the reality's hit. But anyway, we can look at that. But the crucial thing is they're all dependent on fossil fuels. If someone says, oh, it's really cheap, solar's never been cheaper. Yeah, because it's made from fossil fuels. Ask them how much would it cost to make those solar panels from solar panels. It would be unbelievably expensive because you couldn't do it, but if you had to get that electricity up to that level where you could use to do the heat processes that are required, and each thinking that those solar panels are only going to last 20, 30 years maximum, then you're going to have to replace them. So each cycle is going to become incredibly expensive. They're cheap because we're not paying the full price for the fossil fuels that go into them. So again, it's the hype. And the reason I'm not anti any of these things. All I'm trying to get across is that we can't have them at the level that we have them. And that the worst thing we could possibly do, given all of the other problems that we have, the planetary problems and crises that we have, is to go down this track of destroying what we have left, trying to replace what we have in fossil fuels. Just trying to maintain what we have now. I'm trying to say the cure will be worse than the disease, because trying to do it when it can't be done will do more harm than not doing anything. And this there's just some more numbers here for the incredible amount. I mean, some people have been working on just calculating how much of the materials we would need, like copper. So the amount of copper we would need to electrify everything, which we would have to do under a nuclear, solar, wind scenario, everything that's done through diesel and oil and stuff at the moment, would be about 5 times, 4 times higher than the known amount of this stuff on the planet. So it's just not feasible. And then there's all the problems with mining and the social and biodiversity impacts that we have. And just to give you an idea, this is just showing the materials, the tons of stuff, non-renewable stuff that goes into it. Here's coal, gas and nuclear, way down here. There's hydro, solar, wind and geothermal. Massive non-renewable material inputs that go into these things and have to be rebuilt. So this is kind of busy, but I'm just trying to pull all this together that we've already got biodiversity on the brink, and then we're going to push it over the brink, just trying to get all these materials to carry on being able to live. We've got peak oil, so 2018 it looks like it's not peak oil as in peak oil there isn't any more oil, but peak oil in is that that it takes so much effort to get it, it's not worth getting it because that energy return on investment goes down. So we've passed the peak in 2018 of oil. We've got all those materials that have to go in there, that per capita increase. A lot of the increase in fossil fuels going into food. I'll touch on this carbon sequestration, but all of this stuff going on here, and it all means more energy. We want to have the same amount of energy in the future. It's going to need more and more energy to do it, and more materials. Trying to cling on to what we have now. And then I had this revelation, which are kind of, it's stupid to say that, but I've been working in this space for so long, and if you'd asked me 20 years ago, I was a bit of a gadget man, and I would have told you that hydrogen is the future and all of these things are the future because I hadn't looked deeply into them. But I had this realization that if we did discover tomorrow this magic energy source, some nuclear or whatever, that didn't have any problems to go with it, would we be better off? And the more I thought about it, the more I think, no, we wouldn't. Because what's enabled us to push everything on the planet to the limits is energy. The only hope for us, because we won't voluntarily do it, is if we run out of energy. If we run out of energy, we can't keep fishing out the oceans. We can't keep chopping down all the trees. We can't keep putting all that fertilizer in to have all those animals on the planet anymore. So I just, if there is some magic out there that no one knows about and that will save us, there's headlines about it, magic every day, but I want you to stop and think about, well, would that actually be a good thing or not? Because this whole thing is predicated on this idea, and I think it's incredibly naive to think in the next 10 years or so we're going to replace an industrial ecosystem that took a whole century to build and was built with the most energy-dense source that we know of, the fossil fuels that I showed you up there on that graph, freely available, plus heaps and heaps of materials, because go back 30, 100 years, it was easy to find those materials. We think that we're going to be able to do that in 10 years. No, we don't think, we are told, and then people just go, oh yeah, that must be right, that we can do that. It's just, when you think about it, it's just so naive to think that. When we understand that we're going to have more and more energy expensive, it doesn't mean dollar expensive, because that all gets manipulated by debt and all sorts of other stuff, but what is pure and doesn't get affected by that is the amount of energy that's required to get the energy. So that's going down. The mineral densities are going down. Population growth, just to remind everyone, if anyone, I keep hearing, but population growth is declining. 80 million people per year, 80 million. The population of New Zealand every few weeks is added to the planet. So all those 80 million more mouths to feed every single year. The rate might be declining, but it's off a much bigger base, so the net change is nothing. I kind of already said this, but if we fixate on replacing fossil fuels with so-called renewable energy, we just swap one race to destruction with another race to destruction. It has to be the only. So trying to do it with this non-carbon or carrying on burning the carbon, they're both incredibly destructive. The middle ground, or the somewhere else ground, is we stop consuming so much. That's why I say degrowth is the only possible future. And we need to kind of put ourselves into maybe I shouldn't be saying this in a church, but if you take the whole existence of the earth and put it into 1 year, then we've been on the earth, we've existed for the last 37 minutes of that year, and the Industrial Revolution, or this last this piece thing we're in at the moment, is 0.2. It's just 0.2 seconds of that year. So I know it's really hard because it's all we've ever known, and it's all our parents have ever known, is this crazy abundance, but it is very, very short term. I want to talk about this idea of net zero, because it's a huge part of the plan for the future of New Zealand and other countries in the world that sign up to the Paris Agreement and everything else is this idea of net zero. So I've touched on the green growth idea. The people say, oh, we're going to have this green growth. We'll still have growth, but it'll be green. I hope I've got across to you now, it doesn't matter what colour the growth is, whether it's black or green, we can't do it because it will destroy what we have left. And there's all this magic stuff that's it's just scams and wishful thinking, or oftentimes really, really genuine. You know, people working, for example, in the I don't know, the wind turbine or the solar panel world, and they genuinely believe that it is the future. Because they're busy working on this narrowed down part of the world. They're not looking at all the interconnections. They're not thinking about what will be the future if we keep having that energy. So, and I think that this net zero 2050 is, and this is a publication here, but I thought I must have got it wrong. It just didn't make sense to me that a whole government policy could be based on this idea that we plant trees and it soaks up carbon and that's good, so we can go fly to the UK or whatever because we plant some trees. But that makes no sense to me as an ecologist, and I thought, what have I missed? I must surely have missed something here. But I haven't missed something. It is utter bullshit. It is utter delusion to think that planting a tree mitigates fossil carbon. It does not. And worse than that, it allows us to think that we can keep on burning carbon. So you plant a tree, you will replace the carbon that was in the tree that was chopped down, which mostly got released to the atmosphere. Some of it will still be in buildings. Some of it will be like in my yacht that's 92 years old and is still being sequestered. But, you know, so you're not accounting, you're accounting for the tree that got chopped down. You're not accounting for any of the fossil fuels that have been released. You could plant this whole country. I figured it out. If you were to match our rate of carbon release that we're doing at the moment with planting trees, you would have to plant 250,000 trees every single day. And then within 2 years, you've got no New Zealand left. You've planted the whole bloody place, including this church and everything. The whole area of New Zealand in 2 years to match our emissions. Or you could plant the whole planet, again, over the top of towns and everything else that are already there and in snowy places where it wouldn't grow. And you would still only get 9 years worth of emissions. So all you've done is kick the can down the road for 9 years and then you've got nothing. Unless you used that time to actually get rid of all of the fossils, then you've achieved nothing. You've just put off the future. So this whole net zero is complete, utter delusion, and humans are so good at it. I've just realised how good we are because we want to hear a nice thing like that we can plant a tree. Everyone loves a tree. Everyone loves planting a tree. I've got nothing against them. They're fantastic. There's one very, very dangerous tree out there, and that's a tree that gets planted so that people can carry on burning fossil fuels. That is the scary tree. And this whole magic energy thing I don't have a problem with, except that what actually happens is people think they don't have to do anything. They think that, oh, it's all magic, it's all happening, I don't have to do anything now. And that's the scariest part of it. I don't care about them telling lies, but what I care about, and because a lot of them genuinely believe it, is that we do nothing because of that. And so I've talked about all that. But it turns out that I've been working on environmental indicators for such a long time. I've got a PhD student that's just done a huge amount of work on it, and we've got a dashboard for New Zealand for a measure of our environmental performance. But it turns out of all of our studies, the best measure of harm is GDP. GDP, so here's GDP plotted against greenhouse gas emissions. Here's GDP plotted against energy use, and here the green line is global GDP, the red line is ecological footprint, and the black line is extraction of raw materials. GDP, economic growth, is destroying the planet. It is the best measure of taking from the planet. And if you include social in that, then it'll be even stronger. So that's the reality we have to face. That's why we can't have growth. Because economic growth is killing the planet. It's the best way of measuring it. And I need to point out, especially in an affluent country like New Zealand, and probably most of the people in this room will be in the 50%, the wealthier 50% of New Zealand, which puts us in the top 10% globally. 10% of New Zealanders are in the top 1% globally. The top 10% is responsible for 50% of the greenhouse gas emissions and about 70% of the material consumption. So we have to get it that we are the problem. It's wealth that means that we buy stuff and we throw shit away and we want to have the big new everything. And we're able to do that, and we are the ones that are causing, and I know it's hard to take, and it's very hard to take when you're being brought up in this paradigm where success is gathering stuff and having a nice house and a nice car and all those kind of things. But we've been kind of trapped by marketing into that belief, and it is ecocidal. It's killing us. And to put that future, so net zero is delusion. We have to have carbon zero, actual zero, by 2050. So just to put that into some reality, it's about 11,000, a bit more than 11,000 megatons. If you convert everything of the fossil fuels, the gas and everything, into oil equivalents, there's roughly 11,000 megatons, million tons of oil equivalent that we burnt in 2018. So we've got, it turns out from now till 2050 is a bit less than 11,000 days. So that's pretty simple maths. We need to reduce by 1 megaton of oil equivalent every day from now until 2050. So what does that look like? Well, that means if we're going to do it with wind turbines, we'd need to build 1,500 wind turbines installed and connected every day from now until 2050. If that seems a bit onerous, we could have a day off and build a nuclear power plant on that other day. Nuclear power plant, so it's one nuclear power plant every day from now, average size nuclear power plant from now until then. That is the reality of just how much we consume from fossil fuels at the moment and how radical that carbon zero by 2050 is. So, I doubt you've ever read this stuff. Nobody's talking about this reality, and we can pretend that it's not happening, and we'll all walk out of here and we'll have to pretend that it's not happening because otherwise we won't be able to survive. But we have to face that reality that's what's coming. This little blip there, that's minus 6,000 years to plus 10,000 years there. That blip is the blip that we're in. We're in that little star up the top there somewhere, and that's all we've known in our lifetimes and many lifetimes. But that's the blip of fossil fuels. This is one-off. It could have done so much, but we're like kids, that got a legacy from the grandparents or an auntie or something like that, and we just went nuts and had the biggest party ever on the weekend, invited all our mates over and trashed the place. And then, now it's Monday morning and the house is wrecked, the toilet's blocked, the reality is hitting of where we've had, and we took it for granted and it's gone, and we could have done such good stuff with it if we realised and thought about it and thought this is a one-off. We have to make the most of this stuff and not waste it, and we just wasted it in a really stupid way. So we have to change how we live, and it's this transformative action. There's none of this incremental stuff that our governments talk about, and no government is going to talk this reality, right? Because they would get voted out immediately. It's not going to come from government. I mean, just any of the things that you can think about, that the kind of stuff that's happening coming up to this election, all the sweeteners that are being handed out to us show how ignorant we are, that we will take that and say, oh, more roads, fantastic, I'll vote for you, shows just how completely uneducated New Zealanders are about the reality, or anybody on the planet. And that if any, just the example with my friend who was the mayor of Kapiti, who bought in water meters a few years ago, and she was gone by lunchtime. You know, the water meters saved 30% of the water consumption on the Kapiti coast. But if you're a political leader who does something like that, then you're gone. Nobody wants that kind of reality. And so that's why we're not going to get it from our politicians, not while we're unaware of what's going on. So we have to realise that we've got to end the self-delusion. We have to start facing up to the fact that we have to kind of figure out ways of actually accounting truthfully about greenhouse gas emissions. We've got a little bit of budget depending on how much you think that you want to risk in global warming because there's all these potential feedbacks. But if we're thinking about 1.5 or 2 degrees, then we might have 10 years worth of burning a bit more. So the thing is that we have to use that on preparation and being ready for this change, not on cruise ships and trips overseas and sky towers and all of that rubbish. There's a little bit left and we should be using it wisely. There are other, again, go to the DAN's website and there are a whole lot of options like tradable energy quotas and things like that are possible solutions for how we could do it. But the reality is we have to massively reduce consumption. There is a low-tech revival happening. You know, there are a whole lot of things that some of us can remember from our lifetimes of how you can live much smaller footprints on the planet. And again, just go to the website to look at those kind of things. When it comes to agriculture in New Zealand and food production, which I've been working on for such a long time, we have this crazy situation now where if somebody wants to do the right thing, you know, when it comes to, say, dairy farming or anything like that, they're up against the fact that we subsidise the bad stuff. So if you want to do the good thing, you're at a massive disadvantage. If dairy farmers want to reduce fertiliser use, for example, the bank will jump on them. We've just seen the latest figures out that is the cost of milk production in New Zealand for a dairy farmer is around $9. They're going to be being paid somewhere just north of $7. And each week there's another announcement about it dropping. So your average dairy farmer is going to lose, who's a Fonterra shareholder, which is most of them, are going to be minus $50,000. So they work all year for minus $50,000. But Fonterra's, if they're shareholders, they're going to get a payout, a dividend of around $50,000. But actually works out $200 more. So they're going to make $200 for a year's worth of hard labour. That is a crazy situation. And the debt levels, when you look at that cost of the $9 milk production, about somewhere between a quarter and a third of that is debt. 40-something to, I think, $1 billion worth of debt on dairy farms in New Zealand. $27 of debt per kilogram of milk solids produced, all going off to offshore banks. You know, that's the kind of bizarre, crazy situation that we've got in, where we're polluting our rivers and pushing out greenhouse gases to make a dried milk powder commodity that ends up as breast milk replacement or junk food additive for the globe. You know, that is the bizarre kind of situation that you end up with in this country. And what I want is the playing field to be levelled. So if the true costs of milk production, if the harm was included, then you would never be doing it in this country. It's only because we subsidise it by not making them pay for the harm that they do that we end up with these stupid systems like we have. So the new food systems for a real livable future they'll be local, there'll be no external. It's really, really simple to understand, and it's not just dairy. It can be, we get just as much harm done from vegetables and hortofenua and pukekohe, because they're industrial processes as well. We get just as much harm coming out of them as we do off dairy farms. So it's not what we're doing, it's how we're doing it. And it's all about, if you're putting stuff in from the outside, then it will leak out and cause problems. If it cycles within the system, then it doesn't the way that we would have been. Monocultures, yeah, they can't. Anywhere you see a monoculture, you know that there's going to be a problem coming from that. And we have to get to the point where we get more energy back from our food than we put into it. Because you can see that if we have to put more energy into our food than we get back from it, then we're on a hiding to nowhere. And really, it's the human problem. I'm a scientist working, as an ecologist, but I more and more realise that it's us, it's the Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology that Edward Wilson talked about. But really, where I see what I'm doing is what James Baldwin's talking about. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So it's really, really important that we face up to that reality, or we will not change. And as long as there's this magic idea that's pushed about in the media that there is a magic future for us, then the chances of us actually doing something become smaller and smaller. So I don't think, coming back to it, that there is any alternative. We will degrow, and it will happen very soon. We can manage our way down and try to do it in an orderly fashion, or we can wait for the disaster. That's our choice if we want to carry on doing what we're doing. So that's the end of my rant, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I think I've gone over.